keep coming back to one detail buried in the official record. 11,000 years ago, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, people archaeologists describe as hunter-gatherers raised limestone pillars, T-shaped, some 5.5 meters tall, carved with foxes, vultures, and scorpions, and then deliberately buried what they had built. Not abandoned, buried. For decades the explanation stayed simple, a ritual closing, performed by the same hands that raised the stones. The latest field reports from the German Archaeological Institute say otherwise. The filling, they admit, is more complicated than anyone assumed. The stone survived 11,000 years. The reason did not. I want to start with the site itself because the official record undersells it. The ridge sits in southeastern Turkey, near modern Şanlıurfa, and for most of human history it looked like nothing. A hill, walked over by farmers who occasionally turned up odd stone fragments and thought little of them. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt came to investigate an old, inconclusive survey report. What he recognized under that hill rewrote the opening chapter of civilization as we know it. He wasn't the first to see the fragments. A previous American-led survey had passed through decades earlier and dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery, nothing worth a second look. Schmidt looked, anyway. The stone he found wasn't medieval. It was older than agriculture itself, and within a few seasons of careful digging, it became clear just how much older. Here's the sequence everyone learns in school. People settle down, farm, build surplus, and only then raise temples and monuments. Göbekli Tepe breaks that order outright. The monuments came first. The farms, the villages, the surplus, all of it came later, sometimes centuries later, in the same general region. That reversal alone has forced archaeologists to rethink what they assumed monumental architecture required. It belongs, as later excavation would show, to a wider regional tradition no one yet suspected existed in 1994, a detail that matters more the further this story goes. The site itself dates to the 10th and 9th millennia BCE, roughly 11,500 to 11,000 years ago, before pottery, before the wheel, before writing, and, by the conventional timeline, before settled, agriculture had taken hold anywhere nearby. UNESCO's own description credits the builders as hunter-gatherers, mobile groups who, by every standard model of how civilization is supposed to work, were not organized enough to plan, staff, and sustain monumental construction. They did it anyway. Raising a single 5.5-meter pillar means quarrying tons of limestone, shaping it without metal tools, and moving it across uneven ground with nothing but rope, timber, and coordinated human effort, which means feeding and housing a workforce through the labour, which means surplus, planning, and a chain of authority capable of organising people who supposedly didn't need any of those things yet. Hunter-gatherers aren't supposed to need any of that. Something here doesn't add up. The pillars themselves are T-shaped, cut from local limestone, arranged in circular and oval enclosures, some reaching 5.5 metres and weighing many tons. Many are carved in relief: foxes, boars, vultures, scorpions, snakes, abstract symbols no one has decoded. The central pillars in each enclosure read as anthropomorphic: arms, hands, belts, worked into the stone, faces left deliberately blank. No two enclosures repeat quite the same combination of imagery, as if each one carried its own specific program rather than a copied template. Researchers have catalogued dozens of distinct motifs across the site, and the variation keeps growing with every new excavation season. Whatever this place was for, it wasn't casual, and then, at some point after each enclosure had served its purpose, the builders did something with no obvious parallel anywhere else from that period. They buried it, not through neglect, not through the slow creep of wind-blown soil over centuries of abandonment. The enclosures were deliberately filled: rubble, animal bone, flint debris, sediment, packed in layers rather than dumped, and excavators have found that layering consistently enough to rule out a single hurried event. The act may have happened in stages, with new construction and old burial possibly overlapping in time, one enclosure closing while another, a short distance away, was still being raised. For years, the explanation researchers reached for was tidy: intentional burial as closure, even reverence. The same community that built an enclosure eventually retired it, the theory goes, the way some traditions retire a sacred object. covering it carefully as part of the very rituals it had been built to host, ensuring preservation rather than decay. Clean story. Assigns motive, continuity, respect. Easy to repeat in a museum placard or a textbook paragraph. It also assumes something the evidence doesn't actually guarantee. That the builders and the buriers were the same people, acting on the same intentions, within a span short enough to call it one tradition, rather than several unrelated ones stacked on top of each other. That assumption is exactly what recent fieldwork has started to complicate. The German Archaeological Institute, which has continued excavation since Schmidt's death in 2014, publishes its findings through the TP Telegrams project. Their own stated assessment: the filling process is more complex than initially thought. Sit with that sentence for a second. It means the backfill isn't uniform across enclosures. It means composition, density, and apparent purpose vary structure to structure in ways a single clean ritual struggles to explain. It means construction and burial may overlap, repeat, or reverse in sequences that don't fit a tidy before and after story. Some enclosures show modification, partial filling, reopening before final burial. Others were closed fast in one episode, with no sign of revisiting afterward. One tradition, one intention, one community. That story should leave behind a more consistent record than this one does. It doesn't. What the fill doesn't contain is any record of who decided to add it, or why. No inscription. Writing didn't exist anywhere on Earth yet. No name carved into a pillar identifying a builder, a priest, a leader, a community. No oral tradition that survived 11,500 years intact enough to tell us, in plain terms, what these people called themselves, or what they called the act of covering their own work. Every name that mattered here is gone, not faded, gone. What's left is the stone, the fill, and a research community now openly admitting the simplest explanation might not hold. So here's where I keep landing. Who made the call to bury it? What did they know that the rest of us don't? Were they protecting something, replacing someone, or simply drifting into an ending no single person ever decided on? Did they walk away believing they'd return, or did they know, even as they packed the last layer of rubble in place, that they never would? The pillars don't say, the fill doesn't say. 11,000 years of silence, and the one answer that would explain everything is exactly the one piece missing from the record. 3 explanations keep circulating for who actually buried Göbekli Tepe, and after decades of excavation, I still can't rule any of them out. Each one fits some part of the evidence reasonably well. None fits all of it cleanly. That alone tells you something real about how confident anyone can honestly be here. And it's worth sitting with before reaching for whichever version feels most satisfying. Take the first explanation and start there, since it's the most intuitive. It keeps the builders and the buriers as the same people, acting out of foresight rather than ritual closure. A flood, a famine, a sudden collapse of the resources that had let them gather and build in the first place, and they buried the enclosures deliberately to protect them, the way a family buries valuables before fleeing a disaster. Not a tomb, a vault. A deposit meant to be reopened someday, when whatever they feared had passed. It would explain the careful layering excavators keep finding, methodical, not panicked. It would not explain why, if they meant to return, no later phase of reoccupation or recovery has ever turned up anywhere in the record across any of the related sites. Whatever they were protecting the site from, they never came back for it. Some who favour this reading point to the careful strata as proof of intent rather than urgency. A community doesn't arrange rubble and bone in deliberate layers while fleeing in genuine panic. But careful, deliberate work takes real time, and time is exactly what a community facing imminent catastrophe rarely has in abundance. Take the second explanation, and it breaks that continuity entirely. Here the burial wasn't performed by the builders at all, but by a different group. Successors, rivals, or simply a new community that inherited the site generations later and chose to end its function rather than continue it. Maybe the original tradition had already gone unfamiliar to them, its meaning lost or no longer relevant to how they lived. Maybe they buried it deliberately, replacing an older practice with their own. This version fits the evidence that fill, composition and burial style differ across enclosures. Different hands, different decades, possibly different beliefs entirely, each closing what came before it on its own terms, with no 2 excavated enclosures telling quite the same story. But it raises a question the first explanation conveniently avoids. If a later group ended the tradition, what happened to the people who had carried it? Did they leave? Did the tradition simply end with them, their knowledge absorbed into whoever buried what they had built, no longer needing names attached to it? Nothing at the site answers that. The third explanation is the least dramatic, and for that reason the hardest to dismiss. No single decision at all. No founding builders with one intention, no later group with a different one. Just a long, accumulated process spanning generations. Enclosures modified, partially filled, reopened, refilled, closed for good, with no one moment any participant would have recognized as the burial. Centuries later, looking back, that slow accumulation gets remembered, or misremembered, as a single deliberate act. The way a family's gradual move out of a childhood home compresses in memory into one day of packing boxes. This explanation fits the layered, inconsistent fill data better than either of the other two, since a process unfolding across generations would naturally produce exactly the variation excavators keep finding from one enclosure to the next. It also offers the least satisfying answer, because it removes the villain, the protector, and the successor all at once. Drift has no one to name by definition. What none of the three theories can supply is a name, and that absence is worth naming carefully, without overstating it. Not a builder's, not a barrier's, not even a tribal or regional identifier later tradition preserved in any form. Whichever version is correct, the people responsible for the most consequential decision at this site vanish from the record at the exact moment they make it, as if the act of deciding erased the decider along with it. I want to be clear that this isn't a quirk of one isolated hill. Göbekli Tepe belongs to what researchers now call the Taş Tepeler network, a cluster of related pre-pottery Neolithic sites spread across a roughly 200-kilometre radius in southeastern Turkey. Karahan Tepe, Seyburt, Sefer Tepe, Yeni Mahalle, and several others identified through ongoing survey work since the early 2020s. Shared construction techniques, shared T-shaped pillar forms, shared iconography, animals, abstract symbols, the same stylized human-like figures, appearing across sites that never had any obvious means of staying in constant contact. Not coincidence. Pattern. Several of these related sites show the exact same pattern. Monumental construction, sustained over generations, followed eventually by deliberate filling or closure. If only Göbekli Tepe had been buried, the explanation could stay comfortably local. One community, one decision, one hill, nothing more to account for. A network of sites, spread across 2 centuries and a wide stretch of territory, all arriving at the same act of closure independently. That's not local anymore. That's a shared practice, carried across communities who may never have met each other directly, transmitted the way a craft or a belief can outlive any single person who held it. And the network preserves exactly as many builder names as Göbekli Tepe does on its own. 0. No inscription, no king list, no genealogy, no oral tradition recorded in writing has carried a single name forward from anyone who built or buried any of it, anywhere across the network. A tradition organized enough to repeat itself across 200 kilometers, consistent enough to share artistic and architectural language for generations, somehow left no trace of who was in charge of carrying it, or ending it, at any single one of its many locations. So, which theory do you believe? Protection, replacement, or drift? Does it matter in the end if all three arrive at the exact same silence? What would it even take at this point in the excavation to recover a single name from any of it? 3 theories. 1 regional tradition spanning multiple sites and likely multiple generations, and a silence that holds steady no matter which explanation anyone prefers. Let me say this plainly before going any further. None of what follows proves a connection to Sumer. The temptation to force one is obvious, and I felt it myself while putting this together. The evidence does not support forcing it. No clay tablet from Mesopotamia names Göbekli Tepe. No inscription identifies the site, its builders, or its location by any term archaeologists can confidently translate, and no serious researcher working on either the Taş Tepeler network or Sumerian textual tradition claims otherwise. I want that on the record before I show you why I still think this material matters. What exists instead is quieter and harder to dismiss outright. A separate, much later tradition, written down roughly 6,000 years after Göbekli Tepe's enclosures were sealed, remembers the same shape of loss, using completely different language in a completely different part of the world, with no need for any contact between the two traditions to make the resemblance worth noting. Start with the Sumerian king list. Compiled from older oral and written sources across multiple surviving copies, it splits human history into two eras divided by a single catastrophe. Before the divide, a handful of kings ruling for spans of tens of thousands of years each. Numbers no modern reader takes literally, but which every ancient scribe who copied the list preserved without correction, generation after generation, rather than quietly rounding down to something more believable. Then, stated flatly, without elaboration, then the flood swept over. The list resumes afterward with range shrunk abruptly to human scale, as though something about the world itself, not just its rulers, had changed at that exact line. That divide isn't unique to the king list. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved most completely in the Eridu Genesis, echoed later in the Atrahasis epic and in the flood account folded into the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a pre-flood world possessing knowledge the post-flood world had to recover rather than simply inherit directly. Central to that transmission are the Apkallu, sometimes called the Abgal, sages credited in later Mesopotamian tradition with bringing the arts of civilization to humanity before the flood: agriculture, building, writing, ritual, and the proper administration of cities. The Hellenistic-era Babylonian priest Berossus, writing centuries later in Greek but drawing on far older Mesopotamian material now mostly lost, recorded a version of this figure as Oannes, a being who emerged from the sea to teach humanity its foundational skills, then departed. He left behind a transmitted body of knowledge. He did not leave behind a continuous record of who had carried it from one generation to the next, or how that chain of transmission had actually functioned in practice, generation to generation. What survives is consistent on one point and silent on another. Consistent. Something existed before the flood, important enough to be remembered as a discrete, lost world, rather than simply fading into ordinary legend. Silent. Almost none of the builders, sages, or knowledge keepers from that earlier world carry forward as identifiable, biographical figures. The Apkallu are described by role, not by personal history. No Apkallu equivalent of a name attached to a specific deed, a specific building, a specific decision. Oannes is a type, repeated rather than singular, reappearing in slightly different forms across different texts. The antediluvian kings have names, but no narrative, only how long they reigned, as if duration were the only detail the tradition managed to keep intact. Why would a civilization capable of writing everything down, grain shipments, temple inventories, king lists stretching back to absurd, mythic lengths of reign, still fail to preserve who its own foundational builders actually were? I keep returning to that question, because the easy answer can't simply be they forgot. Forgetting is gradual, partial, uneven. This isn't forgetting. This is a clean structural gap, the same shape every single time it appears, regardless of which text records it. Here's where the resonance with Göbekli Tepe becomes worth naming carefully, without overstating it. Both records describe a transition, a moment after which something earlier became inaccessible to direct memory, replaced instead by a story about the transition itself. Both describe builders or founders whose work outlasted their identities by an enormous margin. Both use the language of closure, a flood that swept over in one tradition, a filling that sealed enclosures shut in the other, each functioning as a hinge between a remembered world and whatever came after it. Neither tradition explains the mechanism by which names were lost while memory of the event survived intact. A flood can erase people without erasing the story that a flood happened. A burial can erase a builder's identity without erasing the fact that something was built and then closed by someone for some reason. Call it a record trail, not a proof. The Sumerian material doesn't extend backward in verified continuity to Göbekli Tepe's era. Roughly 7,000 years separate the enclosures from the earliest written king lists, a gap no single document, inscription, or archaeological find currently bridges. What the Sumerian sources offer isn't evidence about Göbekli Tepe specifically, and I won't pretend otherwise. It's a demonstrated pattern, a literate civilization, fully capable of naming its kings in exhaustive, repetitive detail across multiple surviving copies of the same text, still losing the names of its own pre-flood knowledge keepers the moment a before and after divide gets imposed on the timeline. No tablet links that memory directly to Göbekli Tepe, and none should ever be claimed without real evidence behind it. None is needed for the pattern to repeat, knowledge and structure outlasting the identities of the people who carried them, across every tradition capable of remembering anything at all about its own deepest past. If a society that wrote everything down still failed at that, does the silence around Göbekli Tepe's pre-writing builders still look like an isolated archaeological gap, unique to one hill in Turkey? Or does it start looking like the same failure, recurring in a different register, at a much earlier and far less forgiving stage of the record, where no writing existed at all to even attempt the preservation? I think it's the second one. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to notice that two civilizations, separated by thousands of years and an entire ocean of cultural distance, with nothing connecting them but distance and time, lost the exact same piece. Not coincidence, the same gap twice. Let me lay the full timeline flat right here, because the acceleration only becomes visible once you see it all at once, beginning to end, without the gaps and caveats that usually soften it. 11,500 years ago, on a limestone ridge near modern Şanlıurfa, people who left no name organised labour no hunter-gatherer society was supposed to be capable of. They raised T-shaped pillars taller than two grown men stacked on each other's shoulders, some reaching 5.5 metres and weighing many tons apiece, carved with foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, and stylised human-like figures that have outlasted every empire that came after them, every script invented since, every collapse and rebuilding the wider region has endured. Then, for reasons no inscription records, because no inscription was even possible yet, those same enclosures were filled, packed deliberately, with rubble, bone, and sediment, layered, not dumped, in a process the German Archaeological Institute now openly admits was more complicated than the old explanation allowed. 3 theories compete to explain that act, and I've laid out all 3 honestly rather than picking a favourite and building toward it. Protection ahead of an approaching catastrophe, deliberate replacement by a later unrelated group, a slow accumulation of small closures eventually remembered as one single deliberate burial. All 3 survive scrutiny reasonably well. None of them survives the absence of a single name attached to the decision. That absence repeats across the wider Taş Tepeler network. Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, Yeni Mahalle, and several other sites still under active survey, a tradition, organised enough to share pillar forms and iconography across 2 centuries and 200 kilometres, and still organised enough to leave behind 0 names anywhere in it, across an entire regional culture that clearly knew how to coordinate. Roughly 7,000 years later, a literate civilization on the other side of the same general region wrote down a memory of its own pre-flood world, a king list with antediluvian rulers reigning for impossible spans of time, a flood that swept over without further explanation, sages called the Apkallu who taught civilization's foundational arts, and then vanished from the record as a type, a role, never a person with a biography attached. No tablet links that memory to Göbekli Tepe, and none should ever be claimed without real evidence behind it. None is needed for the pattern to repeat, knowledge and structure outlasting the identities of the people who carried them, every single time across every tradition capable of remembering anything at all about its own deepest past. Picture, just for a moment, one of the people who actually did this. Not a name, none survived, but a composite, built honestly from what the evidence allows and no further than that. Someone who spent years of their life moving stone that weighed more than entire families put together, who carved a vulture or a fox into limestone with tools that left no metal trace behind, who stood inside a finished enclosure and understood, in a way I can only guess at, what it meant to the people gathered there with them. And then, one day, by their own hand, or a stranger's hand, or by a drift so gradual that no single day stood out from any other, that enclosure began to disappear under packed earth and broken stone. Whoever made that call believed something worth acting on, worth organising labour for over a long stretch of time, worth repeating at site after site across an entire regional network. They left the structure standing, buried but intact. They left the carved stones facing whatever quiet darkness the fill created around them. They did not leave us a way to know their name, their reasoning, or their fear. Not a villain in this story, not a hero either. Just a person making a real decision 11,000 years before anyone alive today thought to ask them why. I want to be honest about what this is and isn't, because that honesty is the whole point of telling it this way, not aliens. Not a lost super civilization with technology beyond Neolithic capability. Nothing in the fill, the pillars, or the network requires that leap, and reaching for it does exactly what I've tried to avoid this whole script. Trading an honest, well-documented gap for a comfortable answer that feels better than not knowing. Hunter-gatherers organised monumental construction before agriculture existed, which is itself extraordinary without any further embellishment needed. They, or their successors, or the slow drift of generations after them buried what they built methodically and repeatedly across an entire regional tradition. A separate civilization, thousands of years and a continent away, preserved the same shape of loss without ever needing to know Göbekli Tepe existed, which is precisely what makes the parallel worth noticing rather than dismissing. The stones survived 11,000 years of wind, sediment and silence, buried and then excavated and then studied under conditions their builders could never have imagined. They held their carved foxes and vultures through every empire, every script, every collapse since, emerging essentially intact the moment archaeologists finally reached them. The builders' names didn't survive past the moment construction ended. The buriers' names didn't survive the act of burial itself, whatever that act actually involved. Every theory here describes a believable human being making a believable human decision, grounded in motives any person today could recognize. None of them can tell us who that person actually was. So go back to where this started, a hill that looked like nothing more than a hill, until someone in 1994 looked closely enough to see what was actually buried underneath it. The pillars are still there, still legible, still carved with animals that meant something specific to people who have no other voice left in the record beyond the stone itself. Who decided this place should be covered? Why? And on what authority? What did they believe? They were protecting, or replacing, or simply letting go of? Stone, fill, and 7,000-year-old memory can't answer any of that. The temple survived. The reason didn't. And that question is still open, still waiting, for anyone willing to keep looking at what's actually in the ground instead of what feels satisfying to believe about it.